This week we will be focusing on characterization. Characterization is the concept or term for analyzing and developing characters within a text. Most words that end in ation are referring to a process. So this is why if you look at the word, you can see that characterization is the blending of the word character and then that suffix ation. So it's referring to the process a writer uses to develop a character. And this can include both physical attributes as well as personality traits. In general, these processes will be grouped into two categories, and that's what we call direct characterization and indirect characterization. It's helpful to think about, in terms of developing a character, how do we get to know a person in real life? This is an interesting quote from an older article, 1946, but I think it's still certainly valid, by a social psychologist that talks about how we will inevitably form an impression of a person when we meet him or her. Most of the time that's going to be driven by a couple of things. Primarily it will be the way a person looks. And then second, usually to that, is the way a person speaks, the way they sound, their voice, the words they used, etc. We make a lot of judgments about people based on those two things. So when we look at this quote, I think you can see how it applies to both writing and analyzing characters in fiction as well. We look at a person and immediately a certain impression of his or her character forms itself in us. A glance, a few spoken words are sufficient to tell us a story about a highly complex matter. We know that such impressions form with remarkable rapidity and with great ease. Subsequent observation may enrich or upset our first view, but we can no more prevent its rapid growth than we can avoid perceiving a given visual object or hearing a melody. So when we think about that in terms of a fictional character, I think it is highly relevant. We get to know a fictional character in much the same way we would get to know a real person in real life. For example, we would probably, if we didn't know them well and someone else we knew did, we might ask our friends about or family about him or her. We would, of course, inevitably make judgments about appearance or what we, sometimes too we make judgments about people based upon group membership, right or wrong. This is, again, what people tend to do. We might also then get to know them personally by paying attention to what they say and what they do. So in fiction, it's really no different. Writers tap into these things that we do in real life in order to help us learn about fictional characters as well. So let's get to direct characterization. What is that exactly? Direct characterization means we're learning about the character from what the narrator or another character tells us directly. For example here, Jane is a cruel person, Molly said. So through dialogue with another character, we may be told something about a particular character that we then have to test. Is it true? Is it not true? We may hear that from a narrator. Jane was often cruel, but only a few people seem to realize it. Often we place a lot more trust into the voice of a narrator than we do sometimes dialogue from another character, because we often equate the narrator with the voice of the author. That can be reliable, and of course, if you've read some stories, sometimes the narrator we find out later is someone that may not be wholly trustworthy. Edgar Allan Poe liked to toy with that concept quite a bit by giving us a first-person narrator that we find out later maybe isn't someone we could completely trust. That's called an unreliable narrator. We also have what's called indirect characterization. And this would, in real life, fall to those things that were mentioned in the second bullet points. When we try to determine someone's character by what they do, their actions, maybe the things they say, and no one is telling us what to think. We have to make inferences. We have to make logical conclusions about the way a person may be or his or her character in general. And the same thing is true, of course, in fiction. So, for example, an author might write, Jane refused to speak to Molly when she realized that Molly could not afford designer clothing. Or Jane said, "That's where you live." So based on those examples, the reader could infer what we were told on the previous screen with direct characterization, that Jane might be superficial, judgmental, and cruel. But we're left to draw those conclusions based on the character's actions or words. When we talk about developing characters, there are often some types of characters that are helpful to understand. When you have a character that's fully developed, they are often referred to as round characters. They have dimension, they are complicated, they have both positive and negative traits. In other words, they're close to real life people, where we have both positive and negative things about ourselves. And the author's attempting to imitate that. They're attempting to make them full and believable characters. This can sometimes make it difficult when we're analyzing fiction, because the character may not be easy to categorize, and we very much like to categorize, unfortunately, sometimes people, as well as fictional characters. This also, though, means that we may be able to be surprised by a character. A character may change, or we may have had a false first impression of a character, and then those ideas will be challenged later in the text, and we may be forced to alter our initial impression. You can also have what's called flat characters. Flat characters are just that. They're the opposite of round. They're not fully developed. They often will only have a minor role within a story, because for obvious reasons, they're not going to be as developed as the protagonist. Flat characters often exist, though they're never there, usually superficially. An author will place them in a story because they can help reveal really important things that we're meant to see about the main character. They can often help forward the plot. They give the main character an opportunity to act, or they allow the main character to speak out against one thing or another, and we learn about that character as a result of the influence of the flat character or minor character. Don't confuse flat characters with what are often called stock characters. Stock characters are truly dependent on stereotypes. They are often flat and not fully developed, but it's a little bit slightly different term there, and they can't totally equate those two things. In fiction, when we, or a novel or a short story, and we have a character who is usually round and is often a main character, they will often also be described as dynamic characters. In other words, they undergo a change. In somewhere in the course of the story, the character grows or develops. He or she is not the same character at the story's end as he or she was in the beginning. The opposite of that are what we call static characters, and they do not change. They intentionally, the author will keep them at a consistent place or role within the story. And this can be really helpful because sometimes we wouldn't notice perhaps the change of a main character without having a very reliable point of contrast through perhaps a static character. The protagonist is what we call the main character within a story. The central conflict of a story will revolve around this character. And this is why I often hesitate to say good guy, bad guy in terms of these terms, because, of course, as the storytelling can get more complex, it isn't always the case. Your main character may not be what we might call a quote-unquote good person. It just happens to be the character that the action is revolving around. The antagonist is usually a character, but it can sometimes be a thing as well. This goes back to something you may have learned in a previous class. Most conflict, when we get to conflict, we'll talk about this, can fall into several categories. Person versus person, person versus nature, person versus technology, person versus society, etc. So sometimes the reason I have, or sometimes thing here, is the antagonist may not be a person at all or another character. It might be something like a disease that the character is having to battle against throughout the story. So just keep that in mind, that an antagonist may or may not be a physical being that the protagonist is having to work against. All right, at this point I want to kind of shift into how reading can really help us to understand character, both in real life and as we continue to read fiction. I like this quote from George Santayana that says, "Imaginative rehearsals for living." That's sort of his way of describing what reading can do for us in terms of understanding character. When we read, we are able to literally sort of try on viewpoints that are not our own. We can imagine then what would happen in my life if I behaved as Atticus Finch. What would happen in my life if I acted like Katniss Everdeen? What if I tried on that perspective or those behaviors associated with a certain character? And the more we read, sometimes this really does inform our decision making in real life. In addition to, of course, your friends and parents, we think, what would they do or what would they tell me to do? We may also then think of fictional characters in that same way. And this can be extremely important to fostering self-knowledge. How do I handle situations? And how does this help me learn about others? Okay. Related to that, then, I wanted to draw your attention to something to be aware of when we read stories and when we're attempting to analyze character. It can sometimes be a challenge because we bring so much of our own lives into a character's situation or conflict or story. And this is called what I would call autobiographical input. Our own experiences and perspectives can greatly impact how we can interpret a character. Can we feel sorry for that character? Can we in any way understand where that character may be coming from or why the character is acting in a certain way? So this is sometimes called prior knowledge as well when you're studying literature. If we substitute our own life experience for the experience of a character, something that can limit us in being able to fully maybe see another perspective. When we think about how we think about certain situations or people, this is called metacognition, and this can be extremely important in our personal development, is recognizing how I'm actually thinking about a situation or about a person. Many employers and employees will be asked to take personality tests that help to identify actually the way we view and handle situations. And I've included a link here if you want to look at it that talks about something called a Myers-Briggs test. It might be something that you've taken before or you've taken something similar in another course. I am going to ask as part of this week's lesson that you fill out a very, very short personality test. And I'm just going to use it as a point of reference as we analyze the fiction for this week's lesson. So it's not the Myers-Briggs or a complete test like that, although there are several free examples of that online. I encourage you to look at that if you have time. But this will just be a very short handout that you'll see later in the lesson. I've also included this image. If you click on the link, you can get a much better view of it and enlarge it. But this gives an example of the Myers-Briggs personality test and its results, the kind of results it will give you. It usually starts with either you're an extrovert or an introvert, And then it goes from there with, how you tend to view things and situations and people. What can be both positives in that and what can present challenges. So I just kind of wanted this in the back of your mind as we talk about character this week, both in analyzing fictitious characters that you read about, but also as you prepare to create your own characters. How would your characters perhaps score on a Myers-Briggs personality test? What kind of challenges would that create for them in the context of your story? So this might be one tool that could be very helpful as you create your own fictional characters. Excuse me. In addition to this concept, I want you to think about how considering our point of view and the point of view of others really helps us understand respect for other characters. Okay, so when we consider the perspective of both ourselves and that of others, we can do what Kant describes as making their ends our own. We can get maybe a little bit closer to that character's motivation and hopefully develop both sympathy or empathy for that character. We can take seriously the rules that that character is using to guide his or her conduct. And that can be really important and get us to a much deeper level of analysis than we might have been before. All right, so here are the things that we often use to analyze character. Of course, physical attributes and generalities are important, but they're usually only important insofar as they can tell us something deeper about the character. So we certainly want to pay attention to physical descriptions, but we wouldn't want to stop there. And I also want to remind you of this. When we analyze character within fiction, we want to focus on an overall impression of the character's character. So rather than just those surface features, when we put it all together, what are we supposed to think about this particular character? What is the author hoping that we will either see or maybe where he or she might want us to feel sympathy or empathy towards a certain character? So I have a list here of some things to keep in mind as you work to develop an overall impression of a character's character. Of course, as you develop your own characters, these are all the things you'll have to pay attention to as well within your own fiction writing. All right. Throughout the entire course, we'll constantly be pointing back to week 1, which is where we talked about the essential life questions and theme. So how do characters help us understand the essential life questions that an author might want us to explore? And this is a critical question. They're existing in the story for a reason, and in large part that reason is to help us get at the critical themes or essential life questions that the author wants us to explore. So as you read and as you write, we want to constantly be thinking about how character helps us to establish theme. The character may directly state a story's theme. Maybe we infer it from their actions, an example of the story's theme. Sometimes a character demonstrates the story's theme by what they choose to oppose, either another character or another action or event within the story. And so a character may just collectively then embody a story's theme altogether, or contradict it, depending on the kind of character we're talking about. Okay, as you move into the analysis portion of this week's work, I want to draw your attention to a document that will be labeled Character Response Sheet. And I would like for you to complete this for the 2 stories that you're being asked to read for this week, which is A Good Man is Hard to Find and A Late Encounter with the Enemy, both by the author Flannery O'Connor. So you'll submit these response sheets as evidence of your reading and analysis, but we'll also be referencing those in our live session that focuses on literary analysis. And hopefully, too, you'll find this sheet helpful as you work to develop your own characters in your piece of fiction, your big story project.